My name is Mohammed Nurhussein. I'm, as Charlotte said, a board member of the Brooklyn for Peace, and also chairman of United African Congress, one of the sponsors of this event. My duty here is really to introduce you to the speakers. But before that, I think the crisis in South Sudan has been festering so long without the kind of attention that it should get. In fact, all the focus has been on Syria, as it should be, but South Sudan is no less a catastrophic event taking place for so many years or a prolonged time. And from 2013 to 2015, something like 1,890,000. By now, they probably are 2 million refugees, have been refugees. And Uganda alone has close to 900,000 of them. There are some 400,000 in Ethiopia and another 400,000 in Sudan, all living in squalor, in camps that are not really fit for proper habitation, cholera outbreaks and malnutrition. In addition to all of that, there have been 2 to 3 million people who have died of starvation, basically, over the years. And so this is a humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding, not to mention the conflict that has been between the president and the vice president and their forces, which are increasingly taking the appearance of some kind of ethnic directed attacks. And like one of the speakers earlier wrote in a paper in Daily News, this is a genocide in the making, unless some intervention takes place. I would like now to introduce you Dr. Bereket H. Selassie. I know him for a long time. He has served as the youngest Attorney General in Ethiopia way back when. You can imagine. I think in the 50s or 60s or something. 60s. And he's been he served the Ethiopian government in various capacities. Then he ran afoul of the system there and left the country. He worked at the World Bank here for a while, and he was called on by when the revolution broke out in Ethiopia. He was called back home to help, with the new country developing its constitution and so on. But again, that revolution eventually turned sour. The military took over, and he had to run for his life. He's always been active for the Eritreans' right for self-determination, and he went to Eritrea and brokered peace between the two fighting factions of the Eritrean Liberation Movement. But eventually, and then he was called to write the constitution of the new nation after it became independent. He did write that constitution, but the current dictator shelved the constitution aside, and his life was threatened. He had to leave the country, and the last several years now he's been professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so, without further ado, I mean, there's a lot you can say about him, but let's stop at that. He will probably tell us a little bit about the constitutional development, the Constitution of South Sudan.
I have been privileged to have been asked to be part of an expert group in writing constitutions of several countries in Africa, including South Sudan, Nigeria, and other countries. It has been one of my most rewarding experiences in being part of the constitution-making process of these new countries. And I was overjoyed when I was asked by people who knew me, having been interested in the history of Sudan, including the South Sudan Liberation Movement. Even as I supported the Eritrean Liberation Movement, we used to have meetings with the leaders of the South, including the late John Garang, whom I met a couple of times while he was lobbying here in Washington. I've never met Salva Kiir, but the kind of story we heard about Salva Kiir's tendency to want to dominate and to eliminate the rival is typical of dictators in Africa.
Just I have a question for both of you. If you know the situation in South Sudan is more ethnic issues, there is a more ethnic problem a long time ago between Dinka and Nuer. And that's why it driven, the crisis became so heavily like this since 2013. So what is your suggestion for the problem? Because the problem is not really between Salva Kiir and Machar, between the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe. Because there is unwritten agreement, there is some rumors like this, unwritten agreement between Dinka and Nuer that the President Salva Kiir will be the president for the first term. And then the next term will be Machar. And this, when it came to Machar preparing for the elections, President Salva Kiir refused, to step down, and then Machar became the president. So that's the source of the problem. That's some analysts, they say like this. So what is your suggestion about Dinka and Nuer? Because it's really it's a big problem. I have another question about like right now we are activists here from Africa, from different places. What is your best solution for us? How we can contribute to solve the situation in South Sudan? Should we support like charity, international, Red Cross, whatever it's IRC, different NGOs operating in South Sudan, or should we make more pressure on U.S. government to stop supporting the President Salva Kiir or maybe President Museveni? So what's your suggestion on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the second half of your question, I think the answer is actually implicit in the question itself. I think if there's a reputable organization involved in relief work, yes, obviously, we should support them. I think the other thing that we could all do is organize events like this and have knowledgeable speakers involved so that we can get as many people as possible engaged in the effort. In terms of saying the problems between Dinka and Nuer go way back, I don't support that notion, because if we say that, that can apply to every African country, right? That can apply to Uganda, it can apply to Nigeria. I mean, we saw how Nigeria was almost torn apart by the Civil War, right? When Biafra tried to secede. So I don't think that is a fair way to analyze it. I think, even in Rwanda, when we saw the genocidal killings between Hutu and Tutsi, it was when political players started to incite violence, right? Appealing to the base sentiments and abusing ethnic differences. And politicians tend to do this, by the way, everywhere, not only in Africa, as you know. We saw that in the political election here last year, right? So I'm saying, I think no politician should be allowed to exploit and abuse ethnicity and to cause the kind of calamity we've seen not only in South Sudan, but in many African countries. So obviously today, I think Salva Kiir thinks he has a military advantage over Riek Machar, and therefore he has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. I think, and I commend what the African Union actually did in terms of the African Union and IGAD to force them to come to the negotiating table and came up with this agreement in 2015, in August 2015. It took a lot of hard work, but at the same time, it turns out that Museveni, who was supposed to be the neutral mediator, was assuring Salva Kiir that if you abrogate this agreement, I will give you the military cover. And that's why that agreement didn't work. I think it's clear there's no military solution. We should find a way to force these parties back to negotiate in good faith and neutralize all the negative armed forces in South Sudan. Thank you.
I just want clarity. I know Dr. Nurhussein asked a question earlier. If the independence of South Sudan was premature, and I don't think that was addressable, probably I missed that, because, and if it was, what was not in place to prepare for the independence of South Sudan that actually led to where we are today? Thank you, sir.
The right of the southern Sudanese people for self-determination after a long war, a murderous war under which a few 100,000 people died, not only because of the war, but because of starvation. That right was something which has been universally recognized. The people had the right, in theory and in practice, to determine their fate, particularly at a time when they had been subjected to horrendous acts of, by members of the Northern Sudanese Party, members of the United States Christian community actually appealed to President Bush that our fellow Christians have been victimized, they have been enslaved, there were cases of people who had been raped and people had been enslaved, and convinced President George W. Bush to help broker the final solution of the meeting between the leaders of Sudan and the SPLA, which finally, of course, led to Sudan's separation, South Sudan's separation. And therefore, when we talk about the right of people to self-determination, we are talking about a very fundamental, very important human rights of people. Nobody doubts that. Whether it was hurried, whether it was done too quickly, I don't know. I don't think so personally. I think the matter had been discussed and debated again and again by the African Union, but before it by the OAU and by the United Nations and the European Union. And the right of the people of South Sudan had been recognized to the extent that everybody, I think, in the European Union and individual governments supported the separation of the South. The intervention of the United States was, of course, based not only on religious grounds but on strategic grounds, because continual fight between the Southern People, Sudan Liberation Front, and North Sudan would create instability, which would not be in the interest of the American strategic and geopolitical interests. And therefore, everybody was of one mind in terms of getting the people of South Sudan obtain their freedom. And of course, the process of the making of the constitution, which took some 3 years, was part of it, of the preparation of the people of South to take over government from the North and become a new nation for themselves. Where things went wrong, I think both of us have said enough about why things went wrong. It had nothing to do with the untimeliness of the granting of independence to South Sudan.
China's interest is obviously on resources as well, particularly oil. The China National Petroleum was a big player. I think China was one of the major importers of oil from South Sudan. But, as you know, because of the conflict, some of the facilities, I believe, were destroyed, and the oil export had peaked, I think, at 300,000 barrels per day. I think it's collapsed to just over 100,000 barrels per day. And a few months ago, some Chinese technicians who were working in the refineries in South Sudan had been kidnapped. And I read an article where apparently Riek Machar played a role in securing their release. So I don't think there are many Chinese technicians, at least as of today, involved in South Sudan, just because of the fighting has disrupted the oil production. I'm glad you asked that question, actually, because remember in Eastern Congo, when M23, a so-called rebel army, which was actually trained and financed by Rwanda and Uganda, was causing a lot of havoc, committing atrocities, a decision was made to disarm M23. And African armies were recruited that were seen to be relatively neutral, not certainly from Uganda, not certainly from Rwanda. They were from Tanzania and South Africa and Malawi. And they were given the green light to disarm M23 by any means necessary, and they disarmed M23 within a matter of weeks and created a more peaceful environment. So it can certainly be done if there is a meeting of the mind. In terms of the proliferation of generals, I think you have a proliferation of generals because, primarily for two reasons. Salva Kiir is trying to buy their allegiance. So if they're a general in his army drawing a salary, there's no need for them to be fighting him. So I think it's just a proliferation as a source of income. If the alternative sources of income, I think they probably could choose a different profession, be engaged in a different profession if they have other skills. If they don't have other skills, South Sudan is a relatively wealthy country. If peace could be restored, if investments can start coming in, I'm sure these are people who would be candidates to lead enterprises in a peaceful South Sudan. I look back at Liberia, I look back at Sierra Leone, at the height of the conflict in those countries. At one time, people believed we could never have peace in these countries. But there was a meeting of the mind, there were major players involved, the international community, the African Union. Now today, compared to about a decade ago, Sierra Leone and Liberia have turned around dramatically, unbelievable. You know, remember when we had daily news, television images of the most brutal killings being committed by children in Liberia and Sierra Leone? Those images are gone today. Many of those kids eventually were rehabilitated, some were trained in crafts, some managed to go back to school. So I think this can also be done for South Sudan, so long as there's a meeting of the minds. I'm actually glad that you brought that up in terms of African agency, because, you know, hopefully we have not conveyed the impression that there are not many people on the ground in the continent agitating, often at the risk of their lives, for change. And the youth in particular, yes, of course, we saw what happened in Burkina Faso when they drove Compaoré the dictator who had killed the popular Thomas Sankara and then ruled for 27 years, tried to get the constitution changed so he could perpetuate his regime. And the young people just came out to the streets and forced him into exile. And then they were supposed to hold elections a year later, and one of the loyalist generals tried to prevent that from happening by trying to take over. That general was driven out as well. So the youth are, in fact, in many situations, trying to take control of their destiny. In Democratic Republic of the Congo, even with the atrocious conditions, the young people are really pushing, and they're using social media and emulating some of the techniques that young people use in this country in terms of mobilizing through social media. So I'm glad you brought that aspect up.
The United African Congress is one of those sponsors, and I would ask the President of the United African Congress to just say a word and answer the question of what the diaspora African community is doing about this,
My role is very simple here as National President of the United African Congress. I think we have worked with supported Brooklyn for Peace initiatives, and we will continue to do that. I want to go to just give some examples, and then you could see that what is happening in the Sudan has happened in other parts of the world. But the difference is the people that make decisions, United States, the P5s that they call them, have not really taken this matter. And the reason for that is, despite the fact that Africa is almost going to be 1 billion people, not a single African sits on the Security Council. That is a problem. So civil society should really begin asking the question, how do we participate, like Dr. Bereket said very effectively, how do we participate in things that affect our own destinies? It's the issue of taxation without representation. If we are not at the table, we don't count. In the United States, with the Trumpism that you all know now, they're talking about slashing the State Department budget, slashing peacekeeping operations. But there's a good news. The good news is civil society can change that. That's how the Vietnam War became a very serious engagement in this country. When people rose up and started building coalitions to others, things do happen. And I'm not predicting that we're going to have a presidential impeachment, but hopefully we need to have a real president that has cares about what happens around the world, that this isolationism cannot work anymore. This is a global village. How do we look at, let me give you 3 examples to show the power of the diaspora. South Africa, apartheid. We don't have apartheid anymore. Ebola, when almost 1,000 people died before the UN began to pay attention. And do you know how it happened? We came together. The diaspora came together and started asking questions. We held the first forum at the UN to tell them that they are not doing what they're supposed to do. When civil society got up, there was money put into these countries, and today we say, thank God, Ebola is something of the past, but they're talking about it now also in the Congo. Recently, very recently, and maybe you should know, there has been a big contest that took 2 years to electing the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros from Ethiopia. There has been no African ever in the history of the world to be elected to that position. After almost 2 years, bringing it almost close to about 2 weeks to the event, we had a meeting and they said the diaspora got involved. Well, guess what? Dr. Tedros for the first time in the history of the World Health Organization, is the Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Bereket, a lot of the diaspora put their resources together, led by, of course, the distinguished chairman, and Milton Allimadi and Dr. Bereket, Dr. Tedros now. We're not taking total credit, but I think we did something to raise the consciousness, the level of consciousness, to say that we can make something. And African leaders came together to lobby the world, and that's how that victory was won. United States, I could end. You have City Council, State Assembly, State Senate, the House of Representatives, the Senate of the United States, and of course the White House. There isn't a single African from the continent elected to any of these positions. That is taxation without representation. So we appeal to civil society. We are now all of the same, in the same village. We need to work together to not looking at people for where they came from, but the contribution that they could make to human society. I thank you very much.